long time ago, there was a tiny little pine tree. And this little pine tree lived in the middle of a great big forest. And as the pine tree looked around, saw all the great big trees and thought to itself, I'm just kind of an ordinary little tree. I wish there was something special about me. I wish I didn't have these ordinary green pine needles. I would like, and he thought of what he might like, and just then, a beautiful carriage came rumbling down the road through the forest. It had gold on the side of the carriage and beautiful glass windows and people dressed in fancy outfits. The pine tree thought to itself, gold, that's what I want. I want gold needles for my branches. If I had gold needles, I'd be the most amazing tree in the whole forest. So that night the little pine tree hoped and he thought and he wished. And lucky for him, there was something nearby, maybe a fairy, or maybe a magic toadstool. But for whatever reason, when he woke up in the morning, poof! He was covered not in ordinary green needles, but beautiful gold needles. And for a while, as the sun reflected off his golden needles, the animals and other trees bent close to look at this amazing little tree. But just before noon, a peddler came walking down the road and saw those gold needles on that tree, and he ran over and he tore off all the needles and took that gold to town to sell it. The little pine tree thought to itself, oh, wait a minute. Gold's not good for needles. It's too valuable. People will steal them all the time. I know. I want needles made out of glass. Glass like the windows of that carriage. Those will be beautiful and not so valuable. People will steal them. So that night he thought and he thought and he hoped and he wished, and sure enough, poof, the next day, he had beautiful glass needles on his branches. And once again, the animals and the plants, they bent over to look at this beautiful tree with those gorgeous glass needles. But as the day wore on and the wind started to blow, as the wind blew, the branches went back and forth until snap, crash, boom! All the needles broke in the wind until they were just laying in pieces all around the base of the tree. And once again, the little pine tree was naked. And thought to itself, no, glass isn't right. It's not nearly flexible enough. I need something more flexible. And he looked around and he thought and he thought, and he saw the beautiful maple leaves, those hand-shaped leaves from the trees in the forest. And he thought, maple leaves. Maple are perfect. I wish I had maple leaves. And he thought and he thought and he hoped and he wished, and the next morning, poof! He was covered in those hand-shaped green maple leaves. That day, nobody really paid any attention to him at all. There are a lot of trees with maple leaves in the forest. But as the sun rose and beat down on the forest plants, that hot sun beat down on those maple leaves on the little pine tree, and the water began leaking out of those leaves and floating up into the air until the little pine tree began to feel drier and drier. Its little roots couldn't pull up enough water from the soil. And he thought to himself, wait a minute, these leaves, they'll make me dry out. I gotta get rid of them right now. And he tore off all those leaves and threw them on the ground. And that evening he started thinking to himself, gold needles were wrong because they were too valuable and people stole them. Glass needles were too fragile and they broke. Maple leaves, they made me dry out because they didn't have that wax coating like my needles do. And what kind of needles should I really have? And he thought and he thought. And he remembered, wait a minute, pine needles. Pine needles aren't very valuable, so no one steals them. They're flexible in the wind, so they don't break. And they're covered in wax, so they don't make the water float up into the air when the sun shines on me. And so once more, he thought and he thought and he hoped and he wished. And when he woke up the next morning, he was covered in beautiful green pine needles. Now, you can still find this tree today if you find the right forest in Denmark. You'll see it's not a little pine tree anymore, but a great big enormous tree. And if you sit down by its roots and listen carefully, you'll hear it still telling this story.